Hello, my name is Dale and these are my books. Today we are going to be talking about a book called Dominion by Tom Holland. Before we talk about the book, I just want to say thank you very much for the comments of a couple of people worried about my level of drinking, but this is really more of a prop rather than a heavy drinking habit in front of YouTube videos. But let's get on with the book. This book drove me nuts. It's a book by Tom Holland. Tom Holland is someone who, perhaps this is a bit mean of me, but he's not a trained historian. He has a bachelor's degree in English, and it seems to me as if he has not really quite learnt the skills of an historian, in my opinion. However, he is a very popular writer, and he's written historical books about all sorts of things, including ancient Persia and so on. So what he's done is that he's written a book, and it's been advertised as an analysis of the contribution of Christianity to Western culture. And this analysis of Christianity reaches its synthesis at the end of the book, its analysis at the end of the book, where he talks about woke culture and says that woke culture, rather than being a repudiation of Christianity, is in fact a perverted form of Christianity, and that the channels of Christianity have not only informed woke, but it is in the air all around us. Christianity is always there. We think in Christian terms, except we just don't know it. First thing about this book, Tom Holland takes 1,000 words to say what could be said in 100 words, and I found this incredibly frustrating at times. The second problem I had is that he talks in a very folksy way, and this is particularly the case with his video interviews, in which there are lots of them on YouTube. If I hear once again how he used to like dinosaurs as a boy, wow, he just goes on about all of this personal stuff where I'm really wanting to know about how Christianity has influenced Western culture. That is how the book was advertised. You open the book, therefore, and as you can see, it's quite a thick book, and what you find is that it's really not an analysis of how Christianity has influenced Western culture at all. It's really just a potted history of Christianity. He's not pretending it to be the history of Christianity. It's very potted, and it is at a level which I think is really quite simplistic. Here I have to admit that this could be me. I have an interest in the history of Christianity. I've read a lot about it, and so when I read a book such as this and I find that it's a bit simplistic, perhaps it's not surprising that I find it annoying and find it too simple. It could be that it's a good introduction for someone who doesn't know much about Christian history. They could enjoy it. The book club I went to tonight, some people were saying that they enjoyed some passages very much, but not some other passages. But it's not a book that I would recommend. In particular, what I found really interesting is that there's a final chapter of the book on woke, and this is where he makes a number of observations about how wokeism is a combination of Christianity. I found it really disappointing, as I did the entire book. Another thing he does, by the way, is that he will make observation after observation after observation, not analyze anything, and then see, aha, that's Christianity that did that. So I've heard him say in a YouTube video, for example, that Christianity was responsible for monogamy, for the idea that a man and a woman should have a relationship exclusive to all others, and that it was the early Christians who introduced this to the world or to Western culture. Whether he's making that claim for the world or Western culture, it is flat out wrong. The Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had monogamy. The ancient Romans had monogamy. And it's not too much to think, I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination, to think that after the Holy Land was under Roman rule for a long time, that it wasn't the Christians who introduced monogamy to Roman culture, but in fact it was Roman law who introduced it to Jewish, to early Christian culture. The Jews at the time, of course, were polygamous, and monogamy was only introduced into Judaism about 1,000 years ago. So I found it frustrating on a whole number of levels. He says, for example, the distinction between homosexuality and heterosexuality, this is at least in his video interviews, was a Christian thing. He said that 19th century science was a Christian thing, and so on. Claim after claim after claim. In what sense is 19th century science a Christian thing? It happened in the West. It happened when the West was Christian. But are you really saying that the scientific method somehow goes back to Jesus? What about the first 1800 years of Christianity? There wasn't much there when it comes to a scientific method. It just happens to have happened in a Christian country. What I think he doesn't make a distinction about is that he doesn't make a distinction between Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Protestantism. Because I think if you look at Protestantism, then you can make some really interesting claims for how Protestantism, or that version of Christianity, has made very unique contributions to the world. And I'll discuss that in just a minute. So Tom Holland's Dominion, there are other books which deal with Christian history. Read those instead. During the discussion, a very interesting question up about the historicity of the Gospels. Historicity is the reliableness of historical sources, and the Gospels are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke, which is to be found in the Bible and the New Testament. My critical mind automatically engaged and said, well, they're not very historically reliable or accurate at all, are they? After all, Matthew, Mark and Luke are anonymous documents. We don't know who wrote them. It was only that the early church decided to give them names, Matthew, Mark and Luke, and that is confusing, or perhaps it was deliberate, to associate those documents with the followers of Jesus, also known as Matthew, Mark and Luke. But it's not seriously contended by historians that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark and Luke are not, we don't know who their authors are. Similarly, they were written after Jesus died. It used to be thought that the three Gospels, sometimes called the Synoptic Gospels, were written perhaps in the 100s sometime, but we now know that they were written closer to the death of Jesus. And at the moment, they really consist of fragments of documents, thousands of fragments of documents in museums around the world, dating from the 100s, late 100s, I think, 200s, 300s, and they've been pieced together, and that's become the Gospels that we can read today in a Bible. So we have the fact that they were not written contemporaneous with the life of Jesus, and they're anonymous, and also there are some events within inside the Gospels which simply don't make sense from an historical point of view. For example, just one example, there is a bit in the New Testament where Jesus is tempted by Satan, and Satan tempts Jesus in all sorts of ways. Just worship me and I will give you this. And Jesus responds to that. And that's a very, very interesting discussion, very interesting religious theological discussion that happens between Jesus and Satan. Well, how do we know that Satan tempted Jesus? Was there someone there who witnessed this and wrote the story down? Or did Jesus tell someone else afterwards and that person wrote the story down? we can see that by engaging our critical intellectual faculties, the use of the Gospels as an historical source to that level of detail fall apart really, really quickly. And if you are going to believe the Gospels, and if you are going to believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he is our Saviour, you do have to do it as a matter of faith, I would suggest. So another interesting point about this is that, on the other hand, it's very easy to say that the early Gospels were not contemporaneous with the life of Jesus, and therefore perhaps they can't be relied upon. But what is very interesting is comparing the life of Jesus with other historical sources, where we have no doubt, or we have no doubt that these people existed, or we talk about them as if we have no doubt that these people existed. We can think about Julius Caesar, for example. Julius Caesar, we can read his writings. We can read the writings of people who met Julius Caesar. We have his portraits on coins. We have contemporaneous statues of Julius Caesar. We're pretty sure that Julius Caesar existed. Then I think the next level down, we would have the existence of Jesus. Now, whether Jesus said this or said that, I think we have to believe that as a matter of faith, if that is what we choose to do. But the academic consensus, as I understand it, is that all of these stories don't pop up all over the place for no reason, and that one of the reasons why these stories do pop up is because there was someone called Jesus, and that Jesus really existed. Perhaps the next person to look at would be Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great is spoken of as a person who existed, yet what historical evidence do we have that Alexander the Great existed? Well, we have some contemporary coins, and we also have contemporary statues, I understand. However, people didn't start writing about Alexander the Great until a couple of centuries after he supposedly died. Yet we speak about Alexander the Great with some confidence that this was a real person who really existed. And then perhaps an historical figure for which there's really very little evidence at all is somebody called the Buddha. The Buddha supposedly existed in India 400-500s BC, and no one started writing about him for centuries after he supposedly died. So take all of that for what you will. It was an interesting discussion that was held at the meeting last night. Part 2 of this review, apart from saying don't bother reading Dominion, is looking at a number of other sources which you might find interesting. First of all, Tom Holand had a debate which you can find on YouTube. It's about an hour and a half long, where he discusses his claims with A.C. Grayling. And I think it's a fantastic debate, especially the last 10 minutes of the debate, where A.C. Grayling essentially says, what have the Christians ever done for us? Name one thing that's remotely Christian, and that's unique. And Tom Holand responds in a bit of a Noam Chomsky way. He's a bit irritated and says, oh, this and that and this and that and this and that. And I don't find that convincing at all. If you look at what Holland says, he refers to lifelong monogamous marriage. Well, as mentioned before, no, that was Roman law. And then he mentions the distinction between homosexuality and heterosexuality. Well, Holland has been reading his Foucault, and the idea that there is a distinction and so on is 10 minutes old, and I don't think that's an original contribution of Christianity. The idea that a man is the son of a god, well, no, the Greeks had lots of people who are half god. They were called heroes. The idea that a man could become God, well, no, that happened with Julius Caesar and with Augustus Caesar. The idea that we are all equal in some fundamental sense, there is neither Jew nor Christian, male nor female, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. Well, no, that existed in Greek philosophy before the time of Jesus. Again, I think if you want to say that there's something unique about Jesus and unique about Christianity, then it has to be done as a matter of faith. However, I think that is slightly different with Protestantism for reasons which we will now discuss. A.C. Grayling has written a book saying that what has really taken off in the history of Christianity is Protestantism. Now, he doesn't actually spend a lot of time on Protestantism, but in his book, The Age of Genius, the 17th century, and the birth of the modern world, I think he does a really good attempt. He puts forward a really good argument arguing that there was something special about the 17th century and that it did create the modern world. A visual representation of this for me was where he discusses that at the beginning of this time period, at the beginning of the 1600s, it was thought by the people of England that if a king were executed, then horses would start to eat other horses. That if you executed a king, it would be such an affront to the natural order of things, and such an affront to the laws of nature, that bizarre things would be happening. And yet, as we know, it was only 50 years later that the good people of London actually did execute their king. And so I think he's correct in saying that that this period, beginning with the early 1600s, was a unique period, and it coincided with the beginnings of Protestantism. He also mentioned some really interesting statistics, looking at the condition of the Catholic and Protestant countries in Europe in 1800, and looking at their material well-being. 40%. People in Catholic countries were 40% materially poorer than people in Protestant countries, and that the levels of literacy were much higher as well. School attendance of the British colonies, when they colonised, were 4 to 5 times higher than school attendance for the Catholic countries. And this is obviously because of the Protestant emphasis on the ability to read the Bible for oneself and to establish a personal relationship with God rather than via the church. So that's an interesting side commentary on history by A.C. Grayling, and also interesting because Grayling suggests that there was indeed a Dark Ages. It's common among some historians, and Tom Holand is one of them, to say that the Dark Ages were not the Dark Ages at all, that everything was intellectually vibrant and there were lots of inventions and all the rest of it. I think that's a bit silly. If you look at the 200-year period in Greece, for example, in Athens, between, say, 500 and 300 BC, and the 200-year period anywhere in Europe, between, say, 580 and 780, where very little happened, we can see that there really was a big difference, and that there was a Dark Ages. And of course it's a matter of emphasis. Some historians will say it was a bit darker than others, but clearly there was a Dark Ages. And I don't see why Holland and others object to that description so much. In a similar vein, there is a book by Neil Ferguson called Civilization, and he doesn't talk much about religion at all, but he does talk about the Protestants and why it was the Protestants who really made a contribution to the development of Western civilizations and Western capitalism. On the other hand, if you think that the Middle Ages were a bit brighter than is sometimes suggested, then a book you might find interesting is this one called God's Philosophers. And essentially this is a pro-Catholic book which suggests that this Catholic-dominated period of European history was a lot more productive than people think. This eventually brings me to a claim by Holland that it's actually Christianity, however defined, which has led to secularism and then to atheism. And I find that a bit of a big claim, apart from the obvious, and that is during the European wars of religion, both the Protestants and Catholics fought themselves to a standstill, and they decided to have the Treaty of Westphalia and not to make religion a life or death concern. And out of that we had a degree of secularism. Commenting upon that and opposing that to some extent is a book called The 7 Types of Atheism by John Gray. And what he says, arguing from another perspective, is that these atheists who criticize religion, you're engaging Christian concepts in order to do so. And if only you knew your intellectual history better, you would realize what you were doing. So to some extent, he's taking up the argument of Holland, but he's doing so on, in my opinion, a really interesting and a really deep philosophical way. Some of this book went over my head, I have to say. And finally, if you do want to read a book on Christianity, may I suggest Geoffrey Blainey's book. This is a little bit difficult to find. He's an Australian author, but he's a very engaging writer, and he's a professional historian. So that does help, I think. So this was supposed to be a review of Tom Holand, and in particular his book Dominion. And just to repeat, I suggest you don't read it. I don't think it's a very good book, but there are lots of books on the history of Christianity that you can read, which will give you a much bigger bang for your buck. One final point. If you're interested in the contribution of Christian ideas to woke, a number of other authors have done this in a lot more detail than you can find in the final chapter of Tom Holand. You can look at The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray, who looks at this issue. You can also look at the book by, forgive my lapse of memory, I think it's called Woke Racism by the American author John McWhorter. And he doesn't really have a very powerful argument, but he goes through that book and looks at the anti-racist BLM movement and suggests that there's something all a bit religious about this. And perhaps the person that I've read that's dealt with this in the most detail is a book by Andrew Doyle. And Andrew Doyle is a writer and also a comedian, and he has written a book called The New Puritans. And here he makes the point explicit that woke activists are the new Puritans. So that's a sort of a multi-review. I hope you found it of interest, and thank you for listening.